Historic buildings represent a tie to our past that connect us with our past that very few other things do. They're large representations of what once was.
I think small towns like this need something to show who they are and how important this building was to our town and bringing things to it.
Seeing where you came from helps you know where you're going forward. Keeps things in perspective. It helps to appreciate how easy we have it compared to our ancestors.
When we lose our historic buildings to a bulldozer, what's truly lost is the physical history. And we can have as many pictures, we can have as many documents as we want, but without the physical structure, it's lost.
The P&IN railroads left Weiser, that was in the early 1890s, 1900. Took them 20 years to build the track up to New Meadows. And then they built 4 major buildings in 1911 in New Meadows. The depot building, the Hotel Hi-Ho, the Hi-Ho residence, and the Beaumont School. When they finished the train station and the town was plotted out, Meadows, which is 3 miles to the east, what happened? Well, what happened was what trains always did. They bought their own farm so they could have a big town much cheaper than buying lots from an existing town. And that was just business. And that's how New Meadows was started, and how Meadows, they took teams of several horses and hauled their buildings down to New Meadows so they could be businessmen here, because it was all over for Meadows, which had served the Warren gold mining camp for years.
Without the railroad, coming to New Meadows and establishing this depot, if they would have decided to put it anywhere else, New Meadows would not be here.
And in this building was the corporate headquarters of the P&IN Railroad. Their engineers, the president, all of the people who were involved in running the railroad used the offices upstairs.
This train depot brought this valley to life. It brought commerce, it brought people, it allowed exchange of goods.
They hauled cattle out of here. I think Circle C had over 1,000 cows, and probably more than that, at a time that they'd ship out. And it'd take a lot of cattle cars. Then it went from cattle to logging, and they hauled logs from here to Council, here to Emmett. They were logging all around the country. And people, in the early days, they brought the train with the regular engine up here, but then they found that as the state built roads up here, companies started hauling people in buses. So here they were competing with the railroad, so they bought these units called the Galloping Goose. And this train was more like a car.
I grew up in New Meadows. I moved here at age 5. I actually lived on this same street that goes right here in front of the depot. Even as a child, I remember thinking what a beautiful building it was. And I think it probably was the arches out front because they're so graceful. And there wasn't anything else, any building around here that even looked remotely like this one.
My first memory of this depot When I was 3 years old and listening to the train come in every morning and blow the whistle. And then just a few short years later, all of a sudden it was gone and the tracks are coming up. And I can remember asking my father, why?
Will Kirby was the president of J.I. Morgan Logging. So when they abandoned this depot in about 1978, Union Pacific told him, tear the building down. We don't need it anymore.
And then as the word spread through town that they were going to tear it down, I was still little, but I was old enough to realize that shouldn't happen.
But he thought, that's too nice a building just to tear down. That could be used for this town some way. So he kept the building on his property. Later he sold it to the city for $1.
For at least 5 years, this building in the ladies' waiting room was our local library before we were able to get a grant to build an actual library.
We had a lot of vandalism with this building in the early 90s and then through the 80s. Once the library moved out and there was no life in it, but just a storage unit in a sense. All the windows were broken out. It was covered in plywood. It was derelict. It was an orphan. It was a sad building.
The interest waned for a few years until 1989. There was an effort to reinvigorate the society. They started over with a grant from the Idaho Heritage Trust.
In order to get a grant, you have to own the property underneath. Will Kirby and J.I. Morgan Corporation gave the land to the depot committee so that we could apply for grants.
I wrote a grant with some help. I'd never written a grant before in my life. Although it wasn't a grant, it was more of a request for some technical assistance. We then brought the conservator architect, Fred Walters, from Oregon. He came over and he said, indeed, this building should be saved.
The walls were sound. They just needed a lot of interior repair. In fact, the area in which we now stand was an empty hole due to mold and rot. The floor had given away entirely.
We had friends who helped carry cement in buckets to make piers when we put the new floor in so that they could support it. A lot of community members helped with that.
We tried to reclaim as much of the wood flooring as we could. We just did not have enough to complete the lobby part, but in the ladies' waiting room, that is all original wood on the floor as well as in the ticket agent's office.
Some of the problems in restoring a large building such as this, obviously the first is money.
We're in a depressed area, so we have to apply for grants. They are the life of this restoration project.
There's so many technical things that have to be covered and discussed and decided.
I was so nervous about the paint colors. This was more of a headquarters, a corporate headquarters, and I couldn't believe that they would use bright orange and goldenrod yellows in here, so I had to figure out how I could quiet them down.
Brad McGarry, who was the contractor, redoing all of the original wood. He reused, replaned, restained all of the window frames. Everything in this is so authentic to the restoration.
The trust was our partner all the way through. I mean, they were there whenever we would call and say, how will we do this window? How will we do this door?
I just happened to be here in the building present when the subcontractor opened up the ticket window. He was pulling the wood off in order to restore it. And underneath the shelf were some very old pieces of paper. that were, I'm sure, were presented to the patrons at the time when they bought their ticket, that they could buy insurance for the train ride. It proved to be a first. No one had ever seen these before. It was just a fascinating tidbit of history.
What I see the depot as now is actually a viable economic contributor to the success and continuing of New Meadows.
We have restored the freight room area and added on to it to make it larger and more readily rentable.
We are halfway between Lewiston and Boise. The people from the north can come here and the people from the south can come here, and it's really an advantage for us because we rent it to them. And it's an advantage for them because they don't have to travel all the way from Coeur d'Alene to Boise or all the way from Pocatello to Lewiston.
We got the frosting on the cake on the bottom part. And the upstairs, the life of the upstairs, we do so hope is going to develop into a visiting artist and an art center.
We are trying so hard to bring in more volunteers to help us take the next step into doing the upper floor.
There is an endowment set up. Mr. William March has done that. Some of the money from that is what's allowed us to restore this latest phase, if you will.
William March lived in this town, New Meadows, when it was first settled. And he used to come down when he was about 6 years old. He'd come down to the depot every day and talk to the ticket agent and say, "Hey, Uncle, you got a nickel for an ice cream cone?" And then he'd go back up to LaFay's ice cream shop, get an ice cream cone and go home and hope his mother didn't know about it.
I know why I'm thankful that it's still here and that a group of people stood up and said, no, this is a part of us. This is why we belong here.
A train depot is just a huge element in the success of a community. At once upon a time, that's what this building represented. Our dream is to have it do that again in a new age.
We have very few historic buildings in New Meadows. This is the only one that's available for the town.
This building is just so alive because it is so light. Light just floods this building and it just lifts your spirits the minute you walk in.
Everything was done so tastefully with help from preservation people and the trust to know how we could do it correctly and how maybe it could be done safely too and according to codes.
It's truly a beautiful building, a beautiful room in the building, and it is a grand structure, one that I hope will be fully utilized someday in the future again.
Meadows Valley can be the table, but the depot is definitely the centerpiece in the middle.
We got the country's deepest river gorge, mountain bluebirds and potatoes galore, sockeye salmon, golden trout. What's the name of the place that I'm talking about? We're north of Utah, south of BC. We got a lot of land for a soul to be free. East of Washington and Oregon too, and we're west of Montana. And wow, oh, 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 people come to visit, stick around to stay. Oh, when you get to Idaho, you never wanna go.